There's a particular type of person who moves through life with a distinctive pattern of engagement. They share almost nothing about themselves. Their social media profiles are sparse or non-existent. They rarely volunteer personal information. They don't broadcast their thoughts, their activities, or their inner lives. But while they share nothing, they observe everything. They're watching, noticing, taking in vast amounts of information about others and the world around them. They see patterns that others miss. They understand dynamics that remain invisible to most. They accumulate knowledge about people, systems, and situations while remaining mysterious themselves. This asymmetry, sharing nothing while observing everything, creates a particular psychological profile that's both fascinating and often misunderstood. So what does it mean when you share nothing but observe everything? What's happening psychologically that creates this pattern? Is it strategic self-protection or something deeper? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who spent his life observing the hidden dimensions of human nature, teach us about why some people become consummate observers who refuse to be observed in return? To understand this, we need to start with Jung's concept of psychological boundaries and the fundamental need for asymmetry. Jung understood that healthy psychological functioning requires clear boundaries between self and other, between what's yours and what belongs to the world. But he also recognized that different people need different degrees of boundary permeability. For some people, relatively open boundaries work fine. They can share freely while also receiving information from others, and this reciprocal exchange feels comfortable. But other people need what we might call asymmetric boundaries. They need to take in information about the world while strictly controlling what flows out from themselves. This asymmetry isn't pathological. It's a legitimate boundary style that serves important psychological needs. People who share nothing but observe everything have often recognized, consciously or unconsciously, that they need this asymmetry to feel psychologically safe. Sharing feels like dangerous boundary violation, while observing feels like necessary information gathering that allows them to navigate the world without risking themselves. Jung would recognize this as a valid boundary configuration, particularly for people who've experienced boundary violations that make sharing feel inherently dangerous. There's also something profound about what Jung called introversion and the introvert's relationship with information flow. Remember, Jung defined introversion as orientation of psychic energy toward the inner subjective world. For introverts, the primary reality is internal, and external information is processed through internal filters before it becomes meaningful. When an introvert shares nothing but observes everything, they're following the natural energy flow of their type. Information flows inward, from world to self, where it's processed, reflected upon, and integrated into internal understanding. This inward flow feels natural and energizing, but sharing would require reversing this flow, pushing internal content outward into the external world. This reversal feels unnatural, draining, and psychologically uncomfortable. People who share nothing but observe everything are often deep introverts, for whom outward sharing violates their natural energy orientation, while inward observation aligns perfectly with how their psyche actually operates. Jung would validate this completely, understanding that for introverts, the natural information flow is inward, and that forcing outward sharing works against their fundamental psychological structure. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the persona and why some people resist creating one. The persona is the social mask we wear to navigate public life. Creating and maintaining a persona requires sharing information about yourself, revealing enough that others can form an image of who you are socially. But this persona creation has costs. It requires energy to maintain. It creates expectations you must fulfill, and it often involves presenting a simplified or false version of yourself that doesn't match your internal complexity. People who share nothing but observe everything have often made a conscious or unconscious decision not to create a substantial public persona. They're refusing to participate in the social contract that says you must present a knowable version of yourself to others. This refusal protects them from the costs and falseness of persona maintenance. They remain unknown, mysterious, undefined by others' perceptions. Meanwhile, they observe others' personas with acute awareness of how much performance, falseness, and simplification goes into social presentation. Jung would understand this refusal to create a persona as potentially wise, protecting authentic selfhood from being reduced to a performed social identity. There's also something crucial about what Jung called projection and the advantage of being unreadable. Jung discovered that people constantly project their own unconscious material onto others. When you're visible and knowable, you become a screen for others' projections. People think they know you, but they're actually seeing their own psychological content reflected back. People who share nothing but observe everything have often recognized this projection dynamic and chosen to avoid it. By remaining unknown, they avoid becoming screens for others' projections. People can't project onto you as easily when they don't have information to work with. This protects them from being fundamentally misunderstood, from having others' unconscious material attributed to them, from being reduced to what others imagine rather than who they actually are. Meanwhile, their observation allows them to see others' projections at work. They watch people project onto each other, and this understanding gives them significant psychological advantage in navigating social situations. Jung would recognize this as sophisticated understanding of projection dynamics and strategic use of invisibility to avoid being misperceived. Jung also understood something about what he called psychological energy and the conservation principle. Psychic energy is finite. You have only so much available, and you must choose how to allocate it. Sharing information about yourself consumes enormous energy. You must decide what to share, how to present it, how to manage others' reactions, how to maintain consistency in your presentation. This ongoing work drains energy that could be used for other purposes. People who share nothing but observe everything have made a strategic choice about energy allocation. They're conserving their energy by refusing to spend it on sharing and self-presentation. Instead, they invest that energy in observation, analysis, and internal development. This isn't antisocial behavior. It's intelligent resource management based on clear understanding of what they value most. They value understanding over being understood, knowledge over being known, internal development over external recognition. Jung would see this as psychologically wise, knowing yourself well enough to allocate your finite energy according to your actual priorities, rather than conforming to social expectations about sharing. There's also something significant about what Jung called the shadow and how observation serves shadow work. The shadow contains everything about ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. One of the most effective ways to become conscious of your own shadow is to observe it in others. When you observe someone displaying a quality you react to strongly, that's often your own shadow material projected onto them. People who share nothing but observe everything are often engaged in intensive shadow work, whether they realize it or not. Their constant observation of others is revealing their own shadow material. They're watching humanity's darkness, complexity, and contradictions play out in others, and through this observation, they're learning about their own hidden aspects. This shadow work requires that they remain observers rather than participants. If they were busy performing and sharing themselves, they'd be less able to observe clearly, and they'd be defending their own presentation rather than learning from what they see in others. Their refusal to share protects their capacity to observe without defensive distortion. Meanwhile, by not sharing, they're protecting their own shadow from premature exposure. They're keeping their darkness private while they work to integrate it through observation and reflection. Jung would recognize this pattern as sophisticated shadow work, using observation of others as a mirror for self-understanding while maintaining privacy around your own shadow material until it's sufficiently integrated. Let's also consider what Jung understood about power and how information asymmetry creates it. Jung recognized that knowledge is power and that different people relate to power differently. When you share nothing but observe everything, you're creating significant power through information asymmetry. You know about others while they know nothing about you. You understand their patterns, weaknesses, desires, and fears while remaining opaque to them. This creates strategic advantage in all interactions. People who share nothing but observe everything have often recognized, consciously or unconsciously, that this information asymmetry is protective power they need. Perhaps they grew up in environments where being known was dangerous, where others used information against them. Perhaps they've learned that visibility makes you vulnerable, while invisibility creates safety. Perhaps they simply enjoy the strategic advantage that comes from understanding others while remaining mysterious. Jung would explore what this power serves, understanding that it might be compensating for earlier powerlessness or might be serving legitimate self-protection needs. There's also something profound about what Jung called the self and ego, and how observation serves self-development over ego gratification. The ego seeks recognition, validation, and social position. Sharing serves the ego by providing these external rewards, but the self seeks wholeness, understanding, and authentic development. Observation serves the self by providing the knowledge and awareness necessary for genuine psychological growth. People who share nothing but observe everything have often shifted from ego-centeredness to self-centeredness. They're not interested in the ego gratifications that sharing provides, the likes, the recognition, the social validation. They're interested in the self-development that observation enables, the deep understanding of human nature, the integration of shadow material, the accumulation of wisdom about how reality actually works. Their pattern reflects psychological maturity, prioritizing genuine development over social recognition. Jung would see this as the wisdom of the second half of life, when concern shifts from building ego position to developing genuine understanding and wisdom. Jung also understood something about what Jung called the collective and the individual's relationship with it. The collective, the mass of humanity, exerts constant pressure toward participation, toward sharing, toward making yourself known and knowable. When you share nothing, you're refusing this collective demand. You're maintaining individual autonomy against collective pressure. People who share nothing but observe everything are often engaged in what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming genuinely individual rather than just a collective being. Their refusal to share is refusal to participate in collective expectations about visibility and participation. Meanwhile, their observation gives them understanding of collective dynamics, allowing them to navigate the collective without being absorbed by it. They can see how collective opinions form, how group psychology operates, how mass movements develop, and this understanding protects their individuality. Jung would recognize this pattern as supporting healthy individuation, maintaining separation from collective, while understanding it deeply enough to navigate it successfully. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the compensatory function and what observation might be compensating for. Jung observed that the psyche naturally compensates for one-sided conscious attitudes. If you're someone who shares nothing but observes everything, your psyche might be compensating for something. Perhaps you're compensating for early experiences of being too visible, too exposed, too known in ways that were harmful. Your current refusal to share is the psyche's attempt to balance earlier excessive visibility, Or perhaps you're compensating for being insufficiently seen, for having your actual depth and complexity never recognized. Your refusal to share shallow information is protecting the depth that was never properly witnessed. Your observation is your attempt to understand the world that never properly understood you. Jung would explore what's being compensated, understanding that extreme patterns of sharing nothing while observing everything often reveal imbalances or wounds that the psyche is attempting to heal through this particular configuration. Let's also consider what Jung understood about thinking types and how observation serves thinking function development. Jung identified thinking as one of the 4 primary psychological functions concerned with logic, analysis, and understanding. People whose dominant function is thinking naturally orient toward observation because observation provides the data that thinking processes. When you share nothing but observe everything, you're often a thinking type, developing your dominant function to high levels. You're gathering enormous amounts of data about human behavior, social dynamics, and how reality operates. You're not sharing, because sharing doesn't serve thinking development, it serves feeling function, which for thinking types is often underdeveloped. Your observation is the necessary data collection that allows your thinking to develop sophisticated understanding. You're becoming an expert on human nature, on social systems, on pattern recognition, all through devoted observation. Jung would never suggest that thinking types should force themselves to share more, thus developing their inferior feeling function. Instead, he'd encourage full development of the dominant thinking function, which observation perfectly serves. There's also something significant about what Jung called active imagination and how observation might support it. Active imagination is Jung's practice of engaging with unconscious material, allowing images and figures to arise and then consciously interacting with them. People who observe everything are gathering material that feeds active imagination. They're taking in human behaviors, archetypal patterns, symbolic imagery, and their unconscious is processing this observed material, using it to generate the images and scenarios that active imagination explores. Their observation provides raw material that their unconscious transforms into psychologically meaningful imagery. Meanwhile, their refusal to share protects the inner space where active imagination happens. If they were constantly externalizing through sharing, they wouldn't have the interior privacy necessary for active imagination to unfold. Jung would recognize this pattern as supporting deep inner work, using external observation to feed internal imaginative processes that lead to psychological development and self-understanding. Jung also understood something about what he called the relationship with the unconscious and how observation affects it. The unconscious communicates through symbols, dreams, and intuitions, but it also communicates through what Jung called synchronicity, and through what we notice in the external world. When you're observing everything, you're creating conditions for the unconscious to communicate through external observation. You notice things that carry symbolic meaning for your own development. You see patterns in others' behavior that illuminate your own psychological dynamics. Your observation becomes a channel through which your unconscious guides your attention toward what you need to understand. People who share nothing but observe everything often have highly developed relationships with their unconscious. They've learned to trust what captures their attention, to follow their interest, to pay attention to what disturbs or fascinates them in others. This observation isn't random. It's unconsciously guided toward material that serves their own development. Meanwhile, their refusal to share maintains the inner focus necessary for hearing unconscious communications. Jung would see this as sophisticated psychological practice, using observation as a method for receiving guidance from the deeper layers of the psyche. There's also something profound about what Jung called the wise old man or wise woman archetype and how observation serves wisdom development. Jung identified these archetypal figures as representations of wisdom that comes from long experience and deep understanding. People who share nothing but observe everything are often developing these wisdom archetypes within themselves. Through constant observation, they accumulate vast knowledge about human nature, about how situations unfold, about what works and what doesn't. This accumulated wisdom makes them potential counselors, advisors, or guides for others, even if they rarely offer their insights unsolicited. Their pattern of observation without sharing is precisely how traditional wise figures operate. They watch, they understand deeply, they remain mysterious, and they speak only when their wisdom is genuinely sought. Jung would recognize this pattern as archetypal, aligned with ancient wisdom traditions that valued observation and understanding over performance and self-promotion. Let's also consider what Jung understood about narcissism and how sharing nothing protects against it. Jung recognized that the ego can become inflated through excessive attention and validation. Social media culture encourages narcissistic patterns by providing constant feedback, likes, and attention that inflate the ego's sense of importance. People who share nothing but observe everything have often recognized this danger and chosen to avoid it. By refusing to share, they're protecting themselves from the narcissistic inflation that constant attention creates. They're not interested in likes or followers or validation. They're interested in genuine understanding, which attention and validation actually interfere with. Their observation allows them to see narcissism operating in others, to watch how attention-seeking distorts personality and undermines authenticity. This observation reinforces their choice to remain outside the attention economy. Jung would see this as psychological health, maintaining appropriate ego boundaries rather than allowing the ego to inflate through external validation. Jung also understood something about what he called the mother and father complexes and how they might drive observation patterns. If you grew up with parents who were intrusive, who violated your privacy, who used information against you, you might develop a pattern of sharing nothing as self-protection. You learned early that sharing makes you vulnerable, that being known is dangerous. Simultaneously, you might have developed heightened observation as a survival strategy, learning to read parental moods and intentions to stay safe. People who share nothing but observe everything often have histories that taught them these patterns. Their refusal to share is rooted in early experiences where sharing led to harm. Their observation is rooted in early needs to predict and manage others' behavior for self-protection. Jung would approach these patterns with compassion, understanding that they were once necessary adaptations that now might or might not still serve the person's needs. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the relationship between inner and outer, and how observation serves inner development. Jung believed that outer events often mirror inner psychological states, and that careful observation of the outer can illuminate the inner. When you observe everything, you're essentially using the external world as a mirror for your internal world. You see your own psychological dynamics played out in others' behaviors. You recognize your own patterns in social situations you observe. You learn about yourself by watching humanity. People who share nothing but observe everything are often engaged in this mirror work. They're using external observation as a method for internal understanding. Every observation teaches them something about themselves, even when they're ostensibly learning about others. This inner-outer work requires that they remain primarily observers rather than participants. Active participation would prevent the reflective distance necessary to see how outer mirrors inner. Jung would recognize this as sophisticated use of projection and observation for self-knowledge, turning the entire external world into a teaching tool for inner development. Let's also consider what Jung understood about psychological maturity and how it relates to decreasing need for external validation. Jung observed that psychological development often moves from dependence on external validation toward internal self-validation. Young people need external feedback to develop identity, but mature individuals have internalized validation functions and no longer need constant external confirmation. People who share nothing but observe everything have often achieved this maturity. They don't share because they don't need the external validation that sharing provides. They've developed internal sources of worth and meaning that don't depend on others' recognition. This allows them to focus on observation and understanding rather than on performing for approval. Their pattern reveals psychological development from dependent validation seeking to independent self-validation. Jung would see this as the achievement of psychological adulthood, no longer needing the external mirroring that children and adolescents require. There's also something significant about what Jung called the transcendent function and how observation without participation activates it. The transcendent function is the psyche's capacity to generate new understanding by holding tension between opposites without collapsing into either side. When you observe without participating, you're holding exactly this kind of tension. You're neither fully in the world nor fully withdrawn from it. You're in the liminal space between engagement and detachment, between knowing and being known, between connection and separation. This liminal position activates the transcendent function, allowing insights to emerge that neither full participation nor full withdrawal would produce. People who share nothing but observe everything are often receiving these transcendent insights, understanding that emerges precisely from their unique position of engaged observation without personal investment. Jung would recognize this as advanced psychological functioning, using the tension of paradoxical positioning to generate wisdom that exceeds what either pole alone would provide. Jung also understood something about what he called vocation or calling, and how some people are genuinely called to be observers rather than participants. Jung believed that each person has a unique purpose, work that only they can do. For some people, that calling is to be witnesses, observers, recorders of human experience. They're meant to watch, to understand, to bear witness to what's happening in their time and place. Their vocation isn't to be actors on the stage, but to be the audience that truly sees the play. People who share nothing but observe everything are often living this calling, whether they consciously recognize it or not. They're fulfilling the essential role of witness, of observer, of the one who sees and understands without needing to perform. This role is valuable, perhaps essential for collective consciousness. Someone needs to be watching, understanding, bearing witness without the distortion that personal investment creates. Jung would honor this calling as he honored his own similar vocation, understanding that the work of observation and understanding is genuine work, not avoidance of engagement, but a different form of engagement. There's also something profound about what Jung called the relationship with time and how observation allows different temporal experience. Jung recognized that different psychological states operate on different timescales. Active participation requires operating on immediate time, responding quickly, reacting in the moment. But observation allows operating on longer timescales, seeing patterns that only become visible over time, understanding processes that unfold slowly. People who share nothing but observe everything have aligned themselves with long time. They're not focused on immediate reactions or quick responses. They're watching how things develop over months and years, seeing patterns that faster-paced participation would obscure. This long-time perspective creates wisdom that short-time participation can't achieve. They understand history, process, development, and change in ways that active participants caught up in immediate demands often miss. Jung would recognize this temporal advantage of observation, understanding that certain kinds of knowledge require stepping back from immediate participation to perceive longer patterns. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the anima and animus, the inner contrasexual figures, and how they relate to observation patterns. For men, the anima is the inner feminine image that carries receptivity, interiority, and depth. For women, the animus is the inner masculine image that carries critical thinking, analysis, and discernment. People who share nothing but observe everything often have well-developed relationships with these inner figures. Men who are consummate observers have often integrated anima qualities of receptivity and sensitivity that allow deep observation. Women who are consummate observers have often integrated animus qualities of critical analysis and objective understanding. Their observation is enriched by these inner figures, allowing both receptive sensitivity to subtle cues and analytical discernment of patterns. Meanwhile, their refusal to share might protect these inner relationships from being disrupted by external performance demands. Jung would explore how the anima or animus supports the observation pattern and whether the refusal to share protects these crucial inner relationships. There's also something crucial about what Jung called individuation and how observation without sharing supports it. Individuation requires differentiating your authentic self from collective patterns and others' expectations. But this differentiation is almost impossible when you're constantly sharing and receiving feedback, because the feedback inevitably influences how you understand yourself. When you share nothing, you're creating the space necessary to discover who you are, separate from others' perceptions. You're not being defined by external feedback. You're defining yourself from within, based on your own observation and reflection. Meanwhile, observing everything gives you understanding of collective patterns that you can then differentiate yourself from. You can see how the collective operates and consciously choose to be different. People who share nothing but observe everything are often successfully individuating precisely because they've created the conditions individuation requires: freedom from external definition combined with deep understanding of what they're differentiating from. Jung would see this pattern as ideal for individuation work. Jung also understood something about what he called psychological defenses, and when they're legitimate, defensive patterns aren't always pathological. Sometimes they protect genuinely vulnerable aspects of the psyche that aren't ready for exposure. Sharing nothing might be a defensive pattern, but it might be a legitimate defense protecting aspects of yourself that genuinely need protection. Perhaps you're protecting creativity that would be harmed by premature exposure. Perhaps you're protecting ideas that need private development before they're ready to be shared. Perhaps you're protecting emotional wounds that are still healing and can't tolerate scrutiny. People who share nothing but observe everything should explore whether their pattern is defensive, and if so, whether the defense is still necessary. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the psyche knows that certain things need protection, and the refusal to share is wisdom, not pathology. Jung would never suggest breaking through defenses prematurely, understanding that defenses serve purposes and should be respected until they're no longer needed. There's also something significant about what Jung called the conjunctio and the ultimate integration of opposites. Jung believed that wholeness requires uniting opposites rather than choosing one side. The ultimate resolution might not be continuing to share nothing while observing everything, but finding a conjunctio that integrates both capacities. This might mean selectively sharing with trusted others while maintaining public privacy. It might mean developing the capacity to share without losing your observational acuity. It might mean finding ways to contribute your observations without exposing your personal life. People who share nothing but observe everything are being called to find their own unique integration. not forcing themselves to share in ways that violate their nature, but perhaps gradually developing the capacity to contribute their wisdom without compromising their essential privacy. Jung would support this individual solution finding rather than prescribing universal answers. Finally, there's something to be said about what Jung called the work of consciousness and how the pattern of sharing nothing while observing everything serves it. Jung believed that the primary human task is becoming conscious, bringing unconscious material into awareness, understanding yourself and reality more deeply. Whether or not you ever change your pattern of sharing nothing while observing everything, the pattern itself is serving consciousness. Your observation is making you deeply conscious of human nature, of social dynamics, of psychological patterns. Your refusal to share is making you conscious of boundaries, of privacy, of the costs and benefits of visibility. You're doing genuine psychological work that develops consciousness, regardless of whether you ever become more sharing. People who share nothing but observe everything are often more psychologically developed, more genuinely conscious than people who share everything without observing much. In the end, what it means when you share nothing but observe, everything is multifaceted and deeply individual. It might mean you're a deep introvert following your natural energy flow. It might mean you're protecting boundaries that were violated in the past. It might mean you're engaged in shadow work through observation. It might mean you're developing wisdom through accumulated understanding. It might mean you're individuating by maintaining separation from collective expectations. It might mean you're serving a calling to be a witness and understander rather than a performer. It might mean you're protecting genuine vulnerabilities that aren't ready for exposure. It might mean you're operating from the self rather than the ego, prioritizing understanding over recognition. Carl Jung would approach this pattern with respect rather than judgment, understanding that it serves important psychological functions and often indicates sophistication rather than dysfunction. He'd explore what the pattern means for you specifically, what it's protecting, what it's serving, what it's developing. He'd help you understand whether it's a permanent aspect of your nature or a temporary defensive pattern that might eventually shift. He'd support you in honoring your actual needs rather than forcing yourself to conform to cultural expectations about sharing and visibility. And he'd recognize that in a culture obsessed with sharing, with visibility, with constant self-disclosure, those who share nothing while observing everything are maintaining essential balance, providing the necessary counterpoint of privacy, depth, and understanding that makes wisdom possible. Your observation is not passive avoidance. It's active engagement with reality at a level that performance prevents. Your refusal to share is not withholding. It's protection of depth that shallow sharing would dissipate. You're living according to an ancient archetype, the wise observer, the witness, the one who sees without needing to be seen, who understands without needing to be understood, who knows that the deepest wisdom often comes not from speaking, but from the patient, devoted work of watching, understanding, and bearing witness to the endless complexity and beauty and tragedy of human existence.